The desert night lay silent, stars cold above the canyon's jagged rim, when a scream shattered the stillness like glass against stone. The narrator said, "The cry rose from the depths, sharp, desperate, and full of fear. Every bird lifted in panic, wings scattering through the dark sky." Jack Sullivan stirred from uneasy sleep, his heart slamming against his chest. His weathered face, lined by years of dust and regret, tightened as he whispered to no one, "It's her voice after all this time." He stumbled toward the edge of his campfire's glow, staring into the abyss below, haunted by a sound he once prayed never to hear again. The canyon answered with silence, yet the echo clawed inside his soul, dragging him back to the past he had buried. Jack Sullivan tried to steady his breathing, but the desert gave no comfort. The narrator said fear clawed deeper than the canyon's edge. He muttered, "It's just a memory," though his voice quivered. The fire shrank to embers, shadows, stretching long across stone. Each echo mocked him, reminding him of blood spilled long ago. The night pressed harder, a weight on his chest, as though the canyon itself remembered his sins. He turned away from the cliff, yet a scream haunted him, curling like smoke through his mind. The canyon dragged Jack Sullivan into memories he fought to bury. The narrator said once Maria Alvarez's voice meant hope, now it cut like a knife. He recalled the woman taken by violence years ago. His fists clenched as he muttered, "Why now? Why tonight?" The wind howled through stone like laughter, cutting him raw. He turned from the cliff, yet every shadow carried her face, every silence sharpened his guilt. Behind him, boots crunched softly on stone, breaking the silence. The narrator said another had heard the scream. Eli Carter stepped forward, eager. Eli Carter said, "You heard it too, didn't you?" Jack Sullivan's jaw tightened, his voice a growl. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered." The canyon swallowed their words, yet fear filled the space between them, heavy and sharp. Jack Sullivan turned from Eli Carter, his voice heavy with regret. The narrator said, "The past clawed back with every breath." He muttered, "It's a ghost, boy, leave it buried." Yet the canyon mocked him, whispering louder in silence. Eli Carter's eyes burned with questions, but fear sealed his lips. Jack Sullivan's revolver grip tightened, his gaze locked on the abyss. He knew the scream would return, dragging truth with it, truth he could no longer escape. The fire was dying as Jack Sullivan paced near the canyon's rim, each step heavy as though carrying a lifetime of guilt. The narrator said, silence pressed on him, but the echo of Maria Alvarez's scream gnawed at his soul. He muttered, "The dead never let go, they cling tighter than the living." Eli Carter watched quietly, uncertain if he was following a man or a ghost. Jack Sullivan stared into the dark and felt the canyon pull him like a noose tightening around his neck. The desert night seemed endless, but inside, his time was running short. At dawn, the canyon glowed red like old wounds reopening. The narrator said, the desert's light showed every scar he wished to hide. The mentor Thomas Gray approached, his limp slow but steady. Thomas Gray said, "You can't outrun it, Jack. The canyon always remembers." Jack Sullivan's jaw tightened as he replied, "I never wanted to come back." Thomas Gray looked at him, eyes heavy with truth. "You were never meant to leave." The sun climbed higher, burning away shadows, but none could burn away Jack's past. By midday, dust swirled through the town below, and Jack Sullivan rode in with Eli Carter close behind. The narrator said every step of his horse felt like a step into the grave. Eyes followed him, whispers carried his name like poison. Inside the saloon, Maria Alvarez appeared, her presence both familiar and distant. Maria Alvarez said, "So you came back, Jack." His voice cracked as he answered, "I heard you calling." Her eyes held secrets, torn between sorrow and betrayal. The room fell silent, every soul waiting for a storm. The sheriff entered, boots heavy on the wooden floor. The narrator said, "Authority stepped into the room, but justice stayed outside." Sheriff William Hayes looked at Jack Sullivan coldly. William Hayes said, "We don't need your kind here." Jack Sullivan replied, "You never needed truth either." Maria Alvarez glanced at both men, her silence sharper than any weapon. Eli Carter shifted uneasily as tension filled the air. The saloon smelled of whiskey and gun oil, thick with old grudges waiting to ignite. Jack Sullivan's hand hovered near his revolver, but Maria Alvarez spoke first, her voice trembling between defiance and fear. Maria Alvarez said, "Stop this before the canyon takes more blood." The narrator said, her plea cut through anger like a blade through smoke. Sheriff William Hayes sneered, "Blood's the only law this place remembers." Eli Carter looked to Jack Sullivan, silently begging him to walk away. But Jack Sullivan's eyes locked on Hayes, the weight of years pressing down, and he knew there would be no easy escape. Dust swirled through the main street as townsfolk whispered Jack Sullivan's name with venom. The narrator said, "Every step he took drew shadows of the past across their faces." An old man muttered, "That's the outlaw who left blood in the canyon." Jack Sullivan kept walking, jaw tight, eyes forward, though every word stabbed deeper. Eli Carter whispered, "They don't know the truth," but doubt lingered in his young voice. Jack Sullivan thought of Maria Alvarez, her scream still alive, and wondered if these people hated him for what he had done, or for what he had failed to do. Inside the stable, Eli Carter discovered a hushed meeting between two deputies. The narrator said, betrayal lurked even in the shadows of law. One deputy hissed, "Sheriff Hayes is planning to use Jack Sullivan's return to bury the truth." Eli Carter froze, his fists clenched. The young man whispered, "So it's not justice he wants, it's control." The horses shifted uneasily as if sensing the danger. Eli Carter realized for the first time that lawmen were just men, and men could rot from the inside. That evening, Thomas Gray sat with Jack Sullivan near the canyon ridge, silence heavy between them. The narrator said, "The elder carried truths sharp as broken glass." Thomas Gray said, "You think Maria Alvarez's scream was only memory. It wasn't." Jack Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "You know something." The old man nodded, gaze far away. "The canyon doesn't echo the dead. Only the living who still suffer." Jack Sullivan gripped the dirt, trembling as hope mixed with dread. Back in town, Sheriff William Hayes spread his influence like wildfire. The narrator said, "Corruption wore a badge polished to shine brighter than truth." Hayes stood on the saloon steps addressing townsfolk. "This outlaw brings only ruin. We must protect our own." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Maria Alvarez stood in the shadows, her hands clasped tight, torn between fear and loyalty. Jack Sullivan's name became a curse on every lip. Night fell, and the canyon roared with silence again. The narrator said Jack Sullivan finally understood. The scream was no illusion. He whispered, "Maria's cry wasn't just memory, it was a call." Eli Carter asked, "You mean she's alive?" Jack Sullivan stared into the abyss, trembling. "Alive or ghost? I have to face it." The canyon wind wailed like a warning, and the weight of truth pressed on him with the force of destiny. In the saloon's back room, Maria Alvarez leaned close to Jack Sullivan, her voice trembling yet sharp. Maria Alvarez said, "Hayes owns this town, and he owns me too." Jack Sullivan's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the table. The narrator said, "Her truth was a blade, cutting deeper than any wound." Jack Sullivan whispered, "So you've stood with him all these years?" Maria Alvarez shook her head. "I stood with survival, nothing more." The silence between them burned hotter than fire, each word dripping with betrayal and longing. Later that night, Sheriff William Hayes strode through the saloon, his boots echoing authority. The narrator said, "Corruption carried itself like law carved in stone." Sheriff Hayes addressed the townsfolk, "This outlaw is poison, and anyone near him shares his guilt." Jack Sullivan stood by the wall, silent, his eyes locked on Maria Alvarez. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her clenched hands told another story. Eli Carter whispered to himself, "They're turning the whole town against us." In the barn, Jack Sullivan met secretly with Thomas Gray, the old man's eyes full of regret. Thomas Gray said, "The man who betrayed you long ago still walks this earth." Jack Sullivan whispered, You mean Hayes? The narrator said. The mentor's silence confirmed what words could not. Eli Carter, hidden nearby, heard every word, his faith cracking like dry wood. The boy's whisper trembled, so this whole time, Hayes was the devil behind it. The truth spread through him like fire. By dawn, Eli Carter confronted Jack Sullivan near the canyon rim, anger burning in his young eyes. Eli Carter shouted, "You knew all along Hayes was behind it, and you left us to suffer." Jack Sullivan's voice broke. "I was broken, boy. I couldn't face him." The narrator said, "Trust once firm as stone now cracked like dry clay." The canyon wind howled between them as Eli Carter turned away, torn between loyalty and betrayal. That evening, Jack Sullivan stood alone at the canyon edge, revolver heavy at his side. The narrator said, "The canyon waited, its silence echoing with betrayal and loss." Maria Alvarez appeared behind him, her eyes full of secrets she could no longer hide. Maria Alvarez said, "You will have to choose, Jack. Me or the truth." He turned slowly, the weight of her words breaking him more than any bullet could. The desert wind carried her voice away, leaving him with nothing but silence. Thomas Gray sat by the fire with Jack Sullivan, his eyes heavy with guilt. Thomas Gray said, "I should have told you years ago. Hayes set the trap that night, and I let him." Jack Sullivan froze, his fists tightening as the fire cracked. The narrator said, "The mentor's truth struck like a bullet, sharper than betrayal itself." Jack Sullivan whispered, "You knew all this time." Thomas Gray's voice cracked, "I thought I was protecting you, but I only chained you to the past." The canyon wind outside howled like judgment. In the saloon's back corridor, Maria Alvarez cornered Jack Sullivan, her face pale but her eyes blazing. Maria Alvarez said, "You think Hayes owns me. The truth is worse. I was his weapon." Jack Sullivan's breath caught as she stepped closer. The narrator said, her confession ripped open wounds deeper than scars. Maria Alvarez whispered, "He made me lure you that night, Jack. I never stopped hearing your voice when the bullets fell." Jack Sullivan's silence weighed heavier than any accusation. That night, Jack Sullivan stood alone at the canyon rim, Maria Alvarez's words echoing inside him. The narrator said, every stone seemed to whisper betrayal. Eli Carter approached, his voice shaking, "Tell me it's not true. Tell me she didn't lead you to your fall." Jack Sullivan turned, his face hollow. "She was a pawn, Eli, but I was the fool." The boy's eyes widened with despair. "Then who can we trust?" The canyon offered no answer, only silence. Inside the sheriff's office, Eli Carter searched through records, desperation guiding his hands. The narrator said, truth was carved in ink sharper than bullets. He found a ledger, its pages naming bribes and blood. Sheriff William Hayes appeared in the doorway, his shadow long and heavy. William Hayes said, "You've been looking where you shouldn't, boy." Eli Carter froze, sweat beading at his brow. The sheriff smiled coldly. Curiosity gets men killed quicker than bullets. The night stormed with tension as Jack Sullivan confronted Maria Alvarez again, her tears carving paths through dust on her face. Maria Alvarez said, "I never wanted your death, but Hayes would have killed me too." Jack Sullivan's voice was a whisper, "You broke me, Maria." The narrator said, in her silence lay both betrayal and love. She stepped closer, trembling. "I chose survival, but I never stopped choosing you in my heart." The canyon wind roared, as if demanding judgment for them both. The night cracked with gunfire as the saloon windows shattered. The narrator said, the town became a battlefield, every shadow alive with violence. Jack Sullivan ducked behind barrels, revolver blazing. Eli Carter shouted, "They've surrounded us." Bullets tore splinters through wood, townsfolk fleeing into the storm of chaos. Sheriff William Hayes' voice roared from the street, "Bring me Sullivan's body." Maria Alvarez cried out, her voice sharp above the gunfire, "Stop this before it consumes everyone." But the night had already drowned in blood and fire. Amid the chaos, Eli Carter pulled Jack Sullivan from cover, dragging him toward the stable. Eli Carter shouted, "We can't hold them here." Jack Sullivan growled, "We finish this tonight." The narrator said the boy's fear clashed with the man's rage. Horses reared in panic, hooves pounding the earth. A bullet grazed Eli Carter's arm, his cry swallowed by the thunder of shots. Jack Sullivan steadied him, fury boiling in his eyes. The old town, once quiet, had become a crucible of betrayal and fire. From the rooftop, Maria Alvarez aimed a rifle, her face twisted in conflict. The narrator said, every shot she took carved a choice between survival and redemption. She fired toward Hayes' men, scattering them in panic. Jack Sullivan glanced up, stunned. Maria Alvarez shouted, I won't be his pawn anymore. For the first time, her bullets fought for him instead of against him. Yet her tears streaked her face, each trigger pull a confession, each recoil a penance. At high noon's ghostly echo, the street cleared for the inevitable. Sheriff William Hayes strode forward, revolver drawn, his eyes cold as steel. The narrator said 2 men, once bound by betrayal, now faced the weight of truth. Jack Sullivan stepped into the open coat torn, eyes blazing with fury. Hayes sneered, you should have stayed buried, Jack. Jack Sullivan growled, and leave you to poison the world, not again. Silence spread like wildfire as every soul in town held its breath. The world slowed as the guns rose. The narrator said, every heartbeat was a drum of fate. Jack Sullivan's hand steadied, Hayes' eyes narrowed, and time seemed to freeze. Then thunder cracked as shots exploded. Dust rose, fire spit from barrels, and silence followed like death's shadow. When the smoke cleared, Jack Sullivan staggered forward, revolver still smoking, eyes blazing with pain and triumph. Sheriff William Hayes fell to the dirt, his power broken. His reign ended beneath the weight of truth and vengeance. The town lay silent after the storm of bullets, smoke drifting like ghosts through the empty street. The narrator said, survivors counted scars instead of bodies. Eli Carter staggered, clutching his wounded arm, his young eyes hardened by war. Jack Sullivan walked past him, his steps heavy, his revolver hanging like a dead weight. Maria Alvarez stood apart, her tears glistening in the pale dusk. The narrator said, what once was fear now became the burden of memory, etched into every soul that remained. Thomas Gray arrived from the canyon's edge, his limp more pronounced under the weight of truth. He looked at Jack Sullivan and said, you've paid the price, but it will never be enough. Jack Sullivan's voice was hollow. I never asked for forgiveness. The narrator said, the old man saw his own past reflected in the broken figure before him. Eli Carter whispered, then what was all this for? Silence stretched like a noose, offering no answers. Eli Carter stood taller now, his wound bound, but his spirit forever changed. The narrator said, the boy carried lessons carved in blood and betrayal. He looked at Jack Sullivan and whispered, I will remember what you've done, and what you've lost. Jack Sullivan nodded slowly, unable to speak. The canyon wind swept dust across their boots, carrying whispers of the fallen. The narrator said in the silence, the boy became something more, no longer a shadow but a man forged by fire. Maria Alvarez lingered in the doorway of the saloon, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by guilt. She whispered, I loved you, Jack, in ways I never understood. Jack Sullivan turned his gaze toward her, but no words came. The narrator said her fate hung between redemption and ruin. She lowered her eyes, knowing her part in the betrayal could never be erased. The silence between them became the last thing they shared. As dawn broke, Jack Sullivan walked alone toward the canyon, his figure shrinking against the rising sun. The narrator said, the outlaw carried ghosts heavier than his revolver. His shadow stretched long, fading into the desert dust. Eli Carter stood behind, silent, watching him vanish into the horizon. The canyon swallowed the sound of his steps, leaving only echoes of Maria Alvarez's scream, haunting yet eternal. The narrator said, some men walk away not to escape the past, but to carry it until the earth itself forgets.